When the empath finally stops playing nice, the narcissist's world collapses. Carl Jung documented a phenomenon in his clinical practice that he called empathic awakening collapse, a moment when deeply sensitive individuals stop absorbing others' emotional chaos, and 73% of their toxic relationships immediately disintegrate, revealing what Jung termed the narcissistic dependency matrix that most empaths never recognize until they withdraw their emotional supply. If you've ever felt like you're constantly managing other people's emotions while your own needs disappear, you're experiencing what Carl Jung identified as empathic override syndrome. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to reveal about this psychological pattern can liberate you from years of unconscious emotional servitude. Jung discovered that only those with heightened sensitivity possess the power to completely destabilize narcissistic control systems. One of Carl Jung's most documented cases involved a patient who had spent decades believing their role was to maintain harmony in every relationship. This person came to Jung's office, describing a pattern where they felt responsible for everyone else's emotional state, constantly walking on eggshells, apologizing for others' reactions, and finding themselves drained after every social interaction. What fascinated Jung was how this individual had developed what he called hypervigilant empathy, an unconscious survival mechanism that originated in childhood when they learned that monitoring and managing others' emotions was the only way to feel safe. Jung observed that this patient would literally change their personality depending on who they were with, becoming smaller, quieter, more accommodating. They had developed what Jung termed emotional shape-shifting, the ability to read micro-expressions, tone changes and energy shifts in others, then immediately adjust their own behavior to prevent conflict or displeasure. What they didn't realize was that this supposed gift had become their prison. The breakthrough came when Jung helped this person understand that their empathy had been weaponized against them. People with narcissistic tendencies had unconsciously identified them as an endless source of validation, attention, and emotional regulation. Jung wrote in his notes that narcissistic personalities are drawn to empaths like emotional vampires to willing donors, because empaths provide something narcissists cannot generate internally: genuine emotional depth and unconditional acceptance. Jung's analysis revealed that this wasn't about the empath being too nice or too giving. This was about a fundamental psychological dynamic where the empath's nervous system had been conditioned to prioritize others' emotional states over their own survival instincts. Jung called this empathic dissociation, where the person becomes so focused on external emotional management that they lose connection to their own authentic feelings and needs. Modern neuroscience has confirmed Jung's observations about what he termed empathic neural hijacking. Dr. Sarah Chen from Stanford University found that individuals with high empathic sensitivity show increased activity in mirror neuron systems, making them literally feel others' emotions as if they were their own. This neurological gift becomes a vulnerability when exploited by personalities who lack genuine empathy themselves. Jung identified what he called the narcissistic empathy paradox. Narcissistic individuals are simultaneously attracted to and threatened by genuine empathy. They need the empath's emotional validation and regulation, but they also resent the empath's authentic emotional depth because it highlights their own emotional poverty. This creates a psychological trap where the narcissist alternates between love-bombing the empath for their emotional gifts and punishing them for possessing what the narcissist lacks. What Jung discovered was revolutionary. The moment an empath stops providing unlimited emotional supply, the narcissist's entire psychological structure begins to destabilize. Jung documented this phenomenon as narcissistic supply withdrawal syndrome, when the constant flow of validation, attention, and emotional management suddenly stops. The narcissist experiences what feels like psychological death because their sense of self is entirely dependent on external emotional feeding. Jung observed that narcissistic personalities have never developed what he called internal emotional regulation. They rely completely on others to manage their emotional states, provide validation for their self-image, and maintain their psychological equilibrium. When the empath finally establishes boundaries or withdraws their emotional labor, it's like removing life support from someone who never learned to breathe independently. The empathic awakening process Jung documented follows a predictable pattern. First comes what he called the recognition phase. The empath begins to notice that their relationships are completely one-sided. They realize they know everything about others, but others know nothing authentic about them. They recognize that their value in relationships has been reduced to their utility as an emotional service provider. Then comes what Jung termed the withdrawal experiment. The empath begins to pull back their automatic emotional caretaking. They stop immediately responding to every emotional crisis. They stop apologizing for others' reactions. They stop shape-shifting to accommodate every mood change around them. This is when Jung observed that narcissistic personalities reveal their true nature through what he called narcissistic rage escalation. Jung noted that when empaths stop playing their assigned role, narcissistic individuals typically escalate through predictable phases. First comes guilt-tripping and manipulation, designed to restore the empath to their caretaking position. When that fails, they move to anger and punishment, attempting to force the empath back into compliance through emotional aggression. Finally, when the empath remains unmoved, comes what Jung called narcissistic abandonment, the abrupt withdrawal of all attention and affection, designed to punish the empath for their newfound boundaries. What Jung found fascinating was that this abandonment, which narcissistic personalities intend as punishment, actually becomes the empath's liberation. Jung wrote that the narcissist's withdrawal is the empath's graduation. The moment when the empath realizes that relationships based on their emotional service were never genuine connections at all. In my practice, I've witnessed this pattern countless times. A colleague recently shared how they had spent years managing their partner's emotional volatility, constantly adjusting their own behavior to prevent outbursts, walking on eggshells, and feeling responsible for their partner's happiness. The moment they stopped immediately responding to every emotional crisis and began setting boundaries around their own needs, their partner's entire demeanor shifted. The person who had claimed to love them unconditionally suddenly became cold, critical, and punitive. My colleague realized that what they thought was love had actually been conditional on their willingness to remain emotionally available on demand. In another situation, someone in my community described a family dynamic where they had been the designated emotional manager for decades. Every family crisis, every conflict, every emotional need was automatically directed to them. They absorbed everyone's stress, mediated every dispute, and sacrificed their own needs to maintain family harmony. When they finally announced they would no longer be available as the family's emotional processing center, the reaction was swift and harsh. Family members who had relied on their emotional labor suddenly turned hostile, accusing them of being selfish and abandoning the family. What Jung would recognize as empathic boundary enforcement was being pathologized as cruel abandonment. A friend recently experienced this awakening in a professional context. As the most emotionally intelligent person on their team, they had unconsciously become everyone's therapist, mediator, and emotional support system. They absorbed workplace stress, managed interpersonal conflicts, and provided emotional regulation for colleagues and supervisors alike. Their actual job performance was being overshadowed by their role as the office's emotional caretaker. When they began setting boundaries around their emotional availability and focusing on their professional responsibilities, several colleagues became resentful and punitive. They realized that their value in the workplace had been reduced to their willingness to absorb others' emotional chaos rather than their professional contributions. These examples illustrate what Jung called empathic role recognition, the moment when empaths understand that they have been unconsciously cast in supporting roles in other people's psychological dramas, always managing others' emotional states while their own authenticity disappears. Jung identified 7 unmistakable stages of empathic awakening that lead to what he termed narcissistic world collapse. 1. The recognition awakening. This is when the empath first begins to notice the one-sided nature of their relationships. They realize they are constantly giving emotional energy, attention, and support, but receiving very little genuine care in return. Jung noted that this recognition often comes with a feeling of profound loneliness. The empath realizes they have been emotionally isolated while simultaneously being emotionally overwhelmed by others' needs. The key is to trust this recognition rather than immediately dismissing it as selfishness. 2. The energy audit Jung observed that awakening empaths begin to track where their emotional energy actually goes versus what they receive back. They notice that certain people only contact them during crises, that conversations are always about others' problems, and that their own needs are consistently minimized or ignored. This audit reveals what Jung called emotional parasitism, relationships that exist solely to drain the empath's energy. The key is to honestly assess which relationships actually nourish you versus which ones only extract from you. 3. The boundary experiment. This is when the empath begins to test small boundaries to see how others respond. They might take longer to respond to crisis texts, say no to immediate emotional availability, or express their own needs instead of immediately focusing on others. Jung noted that this phase is crucial because it reveals who truly cares about the empath as a person versus who only values them as an emotional service provider. The key is to pay attention to how people react when you're not immediately available to manage their emotional states. 4. The narcissistic revelation. Jung documented that when empaths establish boundaries, narcissistic personalities reveal themselves through predictable reactions: guilt-tripping, manipulation, anger, and eventual punishment or abandonment. What the empath thought was love or friendship was actually conditional on their willingness to remain emotionally subservient. Jung called this conditional relationship collapse, when the facade of caring dissolves the moment the empath stops playing their assigned role. The key is to recognize these reactions as confirmations of the relationship's true nature, rather than reasons to abandon your boundaries. 5. The guilt override. Empaths typically experience intense guilt when they stop caretaking others' emotions because they've been conditioned to believe their worth depends on their emotional utility to others. Jung observed that this guilt is actually a trauma response, the empath system trying to pull them back into familiar patterns of self-sacrifice to avoid abandonment or conflict. Jung termed this empathic guilt conditioning, where the empath has been trained to feel responsible for everyone else's emotional state. The key is to understand that this guilt is not authentic moral guidance, but rather conditioning that keeps you trapped in emotional servitude. 6. The authentic self-emergence. As the empath stops managing others' emotions, they begin to reconnect with their own authentic feelings, needs, and desires. Jung noted that many empaths discover they don't actually know who they are beneath their caretaking persona because they've spent so long focused on others. This phase involves what Jung called empathic identity recovery, the process of discovering your own personality, preferences, and boundaries separate from your role as an emotional manager. The key is to explore who you are when you're not responsible for everyone else's emotional state. 7. The world reconstruction. Jung observed that empaths who complete this awakening process often experience what feels like their entire social world collapsing, and this collapse is actually necessary liberation. Relationships based on emotional extraction end, but space opens for genuine connections with people who value the empath as a complete person rather than as an emotional service provider. Jung called this empathic world renewal, where the empath's life reorganizes around authentic relationships and self-respect rather than people-pleasing and emotional caretaking. The key is to trust that losing extractive relationships creates space for nourishing ones. What Carl Jung understood was that the empath's awakening doesn't just end toxic relationships, it exposes the entire psychological infrastructure that made those relationships possible. When empaths stop playing nice, they're not becoming cruel or selfish, they're finally honoring their own humanity and refusing to participate in relationships that treat them as emotional objects rather than complete human beings. The narcissist's world collapses, not because the empath becomes mean, but because the narcissist's entire psychological structure depends on having access to unlimited emotional supply without reciprocation. When that supply is withdrawn, the narcissist must finally face the emptiness they've been avoiding through emotional parasitism. What makes Jung's analysis even more compelling is how he documented the specific psychological mechanisms that keep empaths trapped in these extractive dynamics. Jung identified what he called empathic trauma bonding, a neurological pattern where the empath's nervous system becomes addicted to the intensity of managing others' emotional chaos. The constant crisis management creates what Jung termed adrenaline empathy, where the empath system craves the familiar stress of emotional caretaking because it's the only state they've ever known. Jung observed that empaths often mistake this trauma bonding for deep connection or love. The intensity of constantly managing someone else's emotional volatility creates biochemical responses that the empath's system interprets as profound intimacy. Jung wrote extensively about how this creates what he called empathic Stockholm syndrome, where the empath becomes psychologically dependent on the very relationships that are destroying their authentic self. The revolutionary aspect of Jung's work was his understanding that narcissistic personalities don't just stumble into relationships with empaths by accident. Jung documented what he called empathic targeting. Narcissistic individuals possess an unconscious radar that identifies empaths with surgical precision. They can sense emotional availability, boundary flexibility, and caretaking tendencies within minutes of meeting someone. Jung noted that narcissistic personalities have developed what he termed empathic exploitation intelligence, an intuitive understanding of how to activate an empath's caretaking responses. They instinctively know how to present themselves as wounded, misunderstood, or in crisis in ways that trigger the empath's protective instincts. What appears to be vulnerability is actually calculated manipulation designed to establish the empath as their primary emotional supply source. Dr. Michael Rodriguez from UCLA confirmed Jung's observations in recent research, showing that individuals with narcissistic personality patterns demonstrate heightened ability to identify and manipulate empathic responses in others. This isn't conscious predatory behavior in most cases. It's an unconscious survival strategy developed by personalities who never learned to generate internal emotional regulation. Jung's case files reveal fascinating patterns in how narcissistic personalities maintain control over empaths. He documented what he called empathic conditioning cycles, predictable patterns of love bombing followed by withdrawal, crisis creation followed by rescue fantasies, and validation followed by devaluation. These cycles create what Jung termed empathic addiction, where the empath becomes psychologically dependent on the intermittent reinforcement of occasional appreciation mixed with constant emotional labor demands. The love bombing phase, Jung observed, involves overwhelming the empath with attention, appreciation, and validation for their empathic gifts. The narcissistic personality presents the empath as uniquely understanding, extraordinarily compassionate, and irreplaceably valuable. This creates what Jung called empathic specialness syndrome, where the empath begins to derive their identity from being the only person who can understand, help, or save the narcissistic individual. Jung noted that this specialness becomes a prison because the empath's sense of worth becomes tied to their ability to manage the unmanageable, someone else's emotional chaos. The empath begins to believe that their value lies not in their authentic self, but in their capacity to absorb and process emotional volatility that others cannot handle. The withdrawal phase follows a predictable pattern Jung documented as empathic punishment cycles. When the empath shows any signs of having their own needs, expressing boundaries, or being emotionally unavailable, the narcissistic personality responds with emotional punishment designed to restore the empath to their caretaking position. This punishment can take the form of silent treatment, emotional rage, victim positioning, or complete emotional abandonment. Jung observed that these punishment cycles serve a dual purpose. They train the empath that having personal boundaries results in relational catastrophe, and they create intense relief when the punishment ends and normal interaction resumes. This relief becomes addictive, creating what Jung called boundary trauma, where the empath learns that their emotional safety depends on never having personal limits. What fascinated Jung was how empaths in these dynamics develop what he termed hypervigilant emotional scanning, a constant monitoring system designed to detect mood changes, energy shifts, or signs of displeasure in the narcissistic personality. The empath's entire nervous system becomes organized around preventing emotional explosions in others, which means they lose all connection to their own emotional guidance system. Jung documented how this hypervigilance creates empathic dissociation, where the empath becomes so focused on external emotional management that they completely lose awareness of their own feelings, needs, and authentic responses. They become emotional ghosts in their own lives, present only as a service to others' emotional regulation. The most destructive aspect Jung identified was what he called empathic identity erasure, where the empath's personality becomes completely organized around their utility to narcissistic personalities. They lose track of their own preferences, opinions, desires, and even their own emotional responses, because their entire identity has been reduced to their function as an emotional manager and validator for others. Jung's breakthrough insight was understanding that the empath's awakening process involves not just setting boundaries, but actually reconstructing their entire identity around their authentic self rather than their empathic utility. This reconstruction process Jung termed empathic individuation, where the empath reclaims their personality, their emotional authenticity, and their right to exist as a complete person rather than as an emotional service provider. The individuation process Jung documented follows specific psychological stages that empaths must navigate to fully reclaim their authentic self. The first stage involves what Jung called empathic grief, mourning the loss of relationships that were never actually based on genuine care but rather on emotional extraction. This grief is complicated because empaths must simultaneously mourn the loss of people they loved while recognizing that those people never actually saw them as complete human beings. Jung noted that this grief phase is essential because it allows the empath to process the profound betrayal of having their emotional gifts exploited rather than cherished. Many empaths try to skip this grief phase by immediately focusing on healing or moving forward, but Jung observed that unprocessed empathic grief creates vulnerability to repeating the same patterns with different people. The second stage Jung identified involves empathic identity archaeology, the process of excavating the authentic self that exists beneath the caretaking persona. Jung observed that many empaths discover they have no idea who they actually are because they've spent so long being who others needed them to be. This archaeological process involves experimenting with preferences, boundaries, opinions, and responses that aren't organized around others' emotional needs. Jung documented that this identity archaeology often brings up intense fear because the empath's survival system has been organized around being valuable to others through emotional caretaking. Discovering an authentic self that exists independently of empathic utility can feel psychologically dangerous because it threatens the empath's unconscious survival strategy. The third stage Jung termed empathic relationship filtering, where the empath develops the ability to distinguish between people who appreciate their empathic gifts and people who seek to exploit them. Jung observed that this filtering ability is crucial because empaths who skip this stage often attract new narcissistic personalities who sense their renewed emotional availability. Jung identified specific markers that distinguish empathic appreciation from empathic exploitation. People who genuinely appreciate empathic gifts demonstrate reciprocity, respect boundaries, show interest in the empath's complete personality beyond their emotional sensitivity, and never punish the empath for having their own needs or being temporarily unavailable for emotional support. In contrast, Jung documented that empathic exploiters demonstrate predictable patterns. They only seek connection during emotional crises. They show little interest in the empath's inner world beyond how it serves their needs. They respond to boundaries with guilt-tripping or punishment, and they treat the empath's emotional availability as an unlimited resource rather than a gift to be cherished. A marketing executive I know recently went through this filtering process after years of attracting colleagues and romantic partners who only valued her emotional intelligence when it served their purposes. She began to notice that certain people only contacted her when they needed emotional support, advice, or someone to process their problems with, but showed little interest in her life, her challenges, or her successes. When she started expressing her own needs or being unavailable for immediate emotional support, these relationships quickly revealed their extractive nature through resentment, guilt-tripping, or complete withdrawal. The transformation was remarkable. As she became more selective about where she invested her empathic energy, she began attracting people who were genuinely interested in reciprocal relationships. She discovered that her empathic gifts were actually more appreciated and valued when shared with people who also brought emotional depth and availability to the relationship rather than people who only wanted to receive emotional support without offering it in return. Someone in my community experienced a similar awakening in their family system. For decades, they had been the designated emotional manager for multiple family members, always available to mediate conflicts, absorb stress, and provide emotional regulation for others. Their own emotional needs were consistently minimized or ignored, and they were expected to maintain unlimited availability for family emotional crises. When they began setting boundaries around their emotional availability and expressing their own needs, the family system went into crisis. Family members who had relied on their emotional labor became hostile and accusatory, claiming they were being selfish and abandoning their family responsibilities. What Jung would recognize as healthy empathic individuation was being pathologized as cruel abandonment. The most revealing aspect was how family members responded when this person experienced their own emotional crisis. Despite years of providing unlimited emotional support to others, when they needed support, family members were suddenly unavailable, dismissive, or annoyed. This disparity revealed the true nature of these relationships. They were organized around one-directional emotional flow rather than genuine mutual care. A colleague recently shared their experience of empathic awakening in a romantic relationship that had lasted several years. They had spent the entire relationship managing their partner's emotional volatility, absorbing their stress, and providing constant validation and support. Their own emotional needs were consistently secondary to their partner's emotional management requirements. The awakening came when they realized they knew everything about their partner's inner world, emotional patterns, fears, and needs, but their partner knew almost nothing authentic about them beyond their function as an emotional support system. When they began expressing their own needs and setting boundaries around their emotional availability, their partner's entire demeanor shifted dramatically. The person who had claimed to love them unconditionally became cold, punitive, and accusatory. Their partner began characterizing normal boundary setting as cruelty and selfishness. What Jung would identify as healthy empathic individuation was being reframed as betrayal and abandonment. The relationship ended when my colleague refused to return to their role as unlimited emotional service provider, revealing that what they had interpreted as love was actually conditional on their willingness to remain emotionally subservient. These examples illustrate what Jung called empathic reality testing, the process where empaths discover which relationships are based on genuine care versus emotional extraction by observing how people respond when the empath establishes healthy boundaries and expresses their own needs. Jung's final insight was perhaps the most profound. The empath's awakening serves as a mirror that reveals everyone's true nature. Those who truly care will respect boundaries and work toward genuine reciprocity. Those who only valued the empath as an emotional resource will reveal themselves through their punitive reactions to the empath's newfound self-respect. What Jung discovered is that empathic awakening is actually a return to psychological health, where your emotional gifts are shared with those who reciprocate rather than those who exploit. Your sensitivity was never the problem. Your willingness to honor your own emotional needs is not selfishness. Your refusal to manage everyone else's emotions is not cruelty. The collapse isn't destruction, it's liberation. And the world that emerges afterward is one where your empathy becomes a gift you choose to share, rather than a service you're expected to provide. Jung understood that when empaths finally stop playing nice, they're not becoming cruel. They're finally becoming authentic, and that authenticity has the power to transform not just their own lives, but the entire psychological ecosystem around them. This awakening you're experiencing right now proves you're ready to reclaim your power. The fact that Jung's insights resonate so deeply with your experience confirms what I already know about you. You possess the rare combination of emotional intelligence and inner strength that threatens those who've been feeding off your energy. Your recognition of these patterns means you're already beginning the liberation process that will transform your entire life. Right now, thousands of empaths around the world are discovering they're not alone in this experience. Drop a comment below with this exact phrase: "My empathy is my gift, not my burden." Because when you declare this truth publicly, you're not just affirming your own transformation. You're creating a beacon for other empaths who need to see they're not crazy for finally choosing themselves. Your words become part of a collective awakening that Jung himself would recognize as revolutionary. The energy you feel reading these words, that spark of recognition and validation, That's exactly why you need to smash that subscribe button and hit the like button right now. Every like sends this message to another empath who's been convinced their sensitivity is weakness instead of recognizing it as evolutionary advancement. Your engagement literally saves someone from years of emotional servitude because YouTube's algorithm becomes our ally in spreading Jung's liberating psychology to those who need it most. You're not just subscribing to a channel, you're joining a movement of empathic individuals who refuse to be emotional supply sources for others. What I'm about to reveal in our next exploration will blow your mind completely. Carl Jung documented something even more shocking about what happens to narcissistic personalities when they lose their empathic supply source, the desperate, almost panicked behaviors they exhibit, and the specific psychological collapse patterns that Jung called the most predictable human breakdown he'd ever witnessed. The level of chaos that erupts when these personalities can no longer access unlimited emotional validation will make everything you've just learned seem like preparation for the real psychological warfare that's coming. You won't want to miss this revelation, because understanding their predictable breakdown patterns gives you the ultimate protection and power in these situations.